This this is the good. Am I handsome?
Welcome to the Mad Scientist Patreon bonus episodes. Episode 2. Actually, the discussion of episode 1.
Hello, my wonderful patrons! It's time for bonus episode thingy number 2. So, we already did number 1, and number 1 was actually on episode 27. So that's confusing, but whatever. We're just going to start on the second one. Starting from the beginning of the series and just going all the way to where we are now, and then continuing them every single week. Oh boy, something exciting has happened. The other mad scientist cat has decided to make an appearance. Her name is Glenda T. Seaborg. Say hi, Seaborg. No, you don't want to say anything? She's very awkward. She doesn't like to talk. Anyways, so the first episode of this podcast was called Does the Paranormal Have a Place in the Modern World? Now it talks. Now it talks. Phenomenal. And so that's kind of the thesis statement of this show. And actually, whenever people say, like, Chris, I want to start a podcast, whatever. I mean, not that many people ask me that question, actually. So, I mean, whatever, like, what the hell am I talking about? But if people were to ask me what they should do if they started a podcast, I would tell them that probably the most important thing is to have a good thesis, like a good idea, a good main statement that you want to say for your show, right? Like, it's no good just doing a show where you're just kind of shooting the crap with your buddies, because eventually, like, you and your buddies might be the most entertaining people in the universe, but why would people seek out your show, right? Like, why would people look for your show? So the idea of this show has always kind of been a continuation of the kind of books and TV shows and things that I found really interesting. So things like Ancient Aliens and The Unexplained Files and, you know, all these shows that were on forever, fact or faked, anything Josh Gates is in or has ever touched, seemingly. There's just so much going on in the world of this kind of stuff, the world of the paranormal, I guess, or UFOs, whatever you want to call it, that we talk about on the show a little bit. It's like the second biggest component of the show besides the science. And the thing that always fascinated me was the students that I talked to, or the people that I talked to in grad school, in the hard sciences, never really understood that there's a lot of stuff that science can't explain. And on the other hand, there were people in my philosophy classes who just completely discounted science. So I'll never forget, I took a class on this type of philosophy called naturalism. And the idea of naturalism is that can we merge the philosophy like of metaphysics with our view of the real natural world? And I thought that class was really cool and it was a great class. But I remember there was someone in that class that just like didn't get it. And so like every paper that they wrote was stuff like, it was all just like pure metaphysics. And it's like, well, you're missing the point kind of. You're supposed to be trying to merge science and metaphysics together. And so one of the biggest problems that I think showcases this is the mind-body problem, which is something that we always talk about on the show. The mind-body problem is basically that we have no good physical, mechanical description of the way thoughts are formed or what relationship thoughts even have with the real world. So we don't know, for instance, what brain state causes what thought to form. And we also don't know even if there is something like this thing we call a soul or a spirit, if it does exist, well, where is it in there? Like, where in the brain is that thing sitting? Like, where is it hanging out? Because we don't know those questions yet. And so while a lot of our paranormal quote-unquote events can be explained by things like, you know, epilepsy, say, or anxiety, or even just simple spontaneous hallucination kind of stuff, there's a part of the very deep question of, is there a spirit that we can't explain just yet? And so a good example of this is what's known as the problem of supervenience. So, or not the problem of supervenience per se, but more like it's described as supervenience. And so supervenience means that a collection of things appears to be greater than the sum of its parts. So a good example of this actually is color. And I know that's like a really cliched philosophy thing, like, yo, bro, what is even colors, man? Like, I don't mean it that way. So, for instance, if we take 100 atoms of silver and smush them together so they're a metal, they're like a block of silver, 1 billion, let's say, atoms of silver, then that bulk item will look silver. It'll have a shininess and it'll appear to be kind of a grayish, whitish color. But as we chop that silver into pieces, does it stay silver past the point that we can't see it anymore? Is a single atom of atomic silver, does that have the same color as a block of silver? We don't know that really. And so, although in some ways we can say things like, well, of course it would, because the light will hit the atom and it will absorb the same amount of light and then release the same amount of light, the quality of color that we would be able to tell that apart from any other color just by seeing it, that quality of color is missing. So in other words, although the physical definition of color might be there, that quality of color, like when we see a color, we think of a color, we're not thinking of a wavelength of light. We're thinking of a specific visual cue that we get. And so how is it that we can think of color but not actually see color or not actually be given that cue? Another example of that would be individual musical notes are their own thing and their vibrations and their pressure waves that attach, that hit the ear. But the feeling you get when you hear a song, so a bunch of sounds all together in a certain rhythm, that is greater than just those pieces of music, just those individual notes and those individual pieces of a pressure wave that build together in time to make a song. And so the penultimate example of this is the brain. Although we know that a brain in some ways gives consciousness, we know that this thing we call the brain is linked somehow to this thing we call a consciousness, because if your brain gets damaged in some way, you lose consciousness. You can go unconscious. We can shock the brain in different ways and have us experience things in our conscious world that we don't normally do. I can't even believe this cat right now. This is horrible news. Why don't you want Daddy to record? What's your problem? What are you doing? So the brain is kind of this penultimate version of this problem, right? Because although we know that the brain itself is in some ways linked to this thing we call a mind, we don't really know that much more than that. Like, we know we can shock different parts of the brain and kind of get interesting things to happen to someone's thoughts. So, for instance, we can shock a certain part of the brain and cause someone to have basically a near-death experience or out-of-body experience. And although that's really cool, we don't really know what that means. Like, does that mean that all out-of-body experiences are caused by shocks that maybe are going on because the brain is malfunctioning or something? Or is it just that we can get access, is it more interesting than that? Can we get access to this part of our consciousness by shocking this part of the brain that we wouldn't normally be able to? So with the mind-body problem, the basic premise is that we know that the brain seems to exist as a thing. I mean, we can look at brains and stuff, but it also seems to exist in tandem with this thing we call a consciousness or a mind. Now, the mind, could we just take all the parts of the brain and stick it all back together in the same exact way and get a mind? That's really the crux question of this problem is consciousness a property of all of the atoms of the brain coming together into cells, into neurons, into all these other things that then make up a brain total, like a material brain? Or is consciousness a secondary thing that just kind of is attached to this material of the brain in a way that we don't really understand? So, because we can't answer that question, I think it leaves a lot of wiggle room for things like spirits or the soul or consciousness to still exist out there. And so it's in these questions, these ideas, these areas where I was really hoping for this show to go. And so I started this show a year ago, and I'm pretty happy with how it's going so far. Like, it's going really well, and I think we're going to keep going with these questions. I think it's going to be really good. So this first episode actually, I originally was thinking of starting a blog. And so I started a blog, and I got 1 follower. And then I was like, this isn't really working. I think these ideas are better if I talk them out, or maybe I even did videos or whatever. And so then when I was able to reach out to Astonishing Legends, they let me help them out, and I got to learn the podcasting world and how it was done. And Scott and Forrest were really good at helping me set myself up, and now it's a podcast. So anyways, that was kind of the hope of that original recording, I guess, or that original episode. Although the quality of the recording isn't where I'd like it to be at this point, I think it's a good first showing, and it kind of gives the general idea of this show, which is how could we merge our current understanding of science and our understanding of how science has changed historically to infer things or get ideas about what we currently consider to be paranormal. Because there were things in the past that we would consider to be paranormal or non-scientific that we now know are scientific, like the germ theory, or, even gravity as a force acting from afar. All of these things are really weird. And so the idea of our paradigms in science shifting over time it's something of a new one since maybe Robert Kuhn wrote his book. So it's a really interesting question, and I think it's one that is especially salient now that we have interesting questions about science and politics and science and religion, and how does science fit in with people's daily experience. So anyways, that's kind of the little recap for this first episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to keep making more and more of these. I'm hoping to just pump these out, basically, so that you will, as Patreon subscribers, get access to, at the very least, the first... all of the episodes that have been downloaded already and already put out there should have one of these videos, I hope, by the end of the month. So hopefully by Halloween. Although we got some really good stuff coming up for Halloween, so I hope you are ready. Alright, thank you again for watching, for listening, and for supporting the show on Patreon.